An arrogant boss named Harold humiliates an elderly black janitor cleaning in the hallway, but when he sees who's been listening, panic sets in. Could this single moment of cruelty unravel his entire world? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Harold Jones strode into the office, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The sound echoed through the quiet space, causing a ripple of tension among the employees. They knew that walk, that purposeful stride that meant their boss was on a mission. Harold's face was set in a stern expression, his brow furrowed with the weight of the day ahead. He had barely slept last night, tossing and turning as he mentally rehearsed his presentation for the investors. This meeting could make or break the company's future, and Harold felt the pressure squarely on his shoulders. As he passed by the cubicles, he noticed a young intern fumbling with a stack of papers. Harold's eyes narrowed. "Wilson," he barked, causing the poor boy to jump. "I expect those reports on my desk in 10 minutes, no excuses." The intern nodded frantically, his face pale with fear. Harold didn't spare him another glance as he continued towards his office. He had more important things to worry about than some clumsy kid. Inside his spacious office, Harold's assistant, Nita, was waiting with a steaming cup of coffee. "Your schedule for the day, Mr. Jones," she said, handing him a neatly typed itinerary along with the coffee. Harold grunted his thanks, his mind already racing ahead to the investor meeting. He gulped down the coffee, barely tasting it. "Make sure no one disturbs me for the next hour," he ordered. "I need to review my presentation." Nita nodded and quickly left the room, closing the door behind her. Harold sank into his leather chair, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He opened his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. As he scrolled through his presentation slides, Harold couldn't shake off a nagging feeling of doubt. Was this enough? Would the investors see the potential he saw? The thought of failure made his stomach churn. Outside his office, the employees worked in hushed tones, stealing glances at the closed door. They knew better than to slack off when Harold was in one of his moods. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety, everyone acutely aware that their jobs could be on the line if this meeting didn't go well. Harold loosened his tie slightly, feeling suffocated. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. From up here, everything looked so small, so manageable. If only running a company was as simple as this view made it seem. With a deep sigh, Harold turned back to his desk. There was no time for doubts or self-pity. He had a meeting to prepare for, and failure was not an option. The future of the company, and his career, depended on it. The office buzzed with nervous energy as employees scurried about, preparing for the crucial investor presentation. Phones rang incessantly, printers whirred, and the clacking of keyboards filled the air. Amidst the chaos, a small, hunched figure moved quietly through the space, almost unnoticed. Mildred Phillips, the elderly janitor, pushed her cleaning cart with practiced ease. Her wrinkled hands gripped the handle firmly as she navigated around desks and chairs. Despite the commotion, Mildred's face remained serene, a stark contrast to the stressed expression surrounding her. As she emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces, a few kind-hearted employees offered her quick smiles or nods. Mildred returned each gesture warmly, though most of the staff was too preoccupied to notice her presence. She had been part of this office for decades, a constant in the ever-changing corporate landscape. Harold emerged from his office, his face set in a determined frown. He marched down the hallway, barking orders and checking his watch. "Where are those financial reports?" he demanded, causing a young analyst to scramble to her feet. As Harold rounded a corner, he nearly collided with Mildred's cart. The old woman looked up, her kind eyes meeting his stern gaze. For a brief moment, Harold's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. He gave her a curt nod, more out of reflex than genuine acknowledgement. "Excuse me, Mr. Jones," Mildred said softly, her voice barely audible above the office din. Harold's mind was already racing ahead to the meeting. He barely registered Mildred's words as he stepped around her cart. Yes, he muttered distractedly, his thoughts focused solely on the presentation looming before him. Mildred watched him go, a hint of sadness in her eyes. She had seen many leaders come and go over the years, each one carrying the weight of their ambitions. With a small sigh, she returned to her work, wiping down a nearby desk with meticulous care. As the morning wore on, the tension in the office continued to build. Harold paced back and forth in the conference room, rehearsing his speech one last time. Outside, his assistant frantically organized handouts and checked the presentation equipment. Mildred made her way slowly through the office, her presence a calming counterpoint to the frantic energy around her. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, an old hymn that spoke of peace and grace. As the investors filed out of the conference room, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the office. The presentation had gone well, and the tension that had gripped the staff all morning began to ease. Employees exchanged small smiles and quiet congratulations, their shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. Harold, however, did not share in the moment of respite. His face remained taut, his jaw clenched as he strode out of the conference room. The weight of leadership pressed down on him, and he felt the constant need to push forward, to achieve more. As he turned the corner into the main hallway, Harold's eyes narrowed at the sight before him. Mildred was on her knees, carefully mopping up a spilled cup of coffee. Her movements were slow but thorough, her aged hands gripping the cloth with practiced ease. Harold's impatience surged. He was in a hurry to get back to his office, to capitalize on the momentum of the successful presentation. Without looking, he stepped directly into the wet spot on the floor. "What the?" he sputtered, looking down at his now soiled shoe. His face flushed red with anger. "What is this?" Mildred looked up, her kind eyes widening with concern. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jones. I was just cleaning up this spill. I should have put up a sign." Harold's frustration boiled over. He glared down at Mildred, his voice rising with each word. "You should have been faster. This is unacceptable." The office fell silent as heads turned toward the commotion. Employees watched with growing discomfort as Harold continued his tirade. "How long have you worked here? Decades, and you still can't do your job properly?" Harold's words dripped with disdain. "Maybe it's time we found someone younger, someone who can keep up with the pace of a modern office." Mildred's face fell, her usual composure cracking under the weight of Harold's cruel words. She struggled to her feet, her arthritis making the movement painful and slow. Harold sneered at her efforts. "Look at you. You can barely stand up. Why are you even still working? Don't you have grandchildren to look after or something?" A collective gasp rippled through the watching crowd. Harold's words had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. But no one dared to intervene. Mildred stood silently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She clutched her cleaning cloth tightly, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her dignity. Harold, oblivious to the shocked faces around him, continued his verbal assault. "And let's be honest, you're not exactly fitting in here, are you? This is a prestigious company, not some charity case for diversity hires." The racial undertone of Harold's comment hung heavy in the air. The watching employees exchanged horrified glances, their discomfort palpable. Mildred, her voice barely above a whisper, finally spoke. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Jones. I'll do better next time." As Harold's tirade continued, a figure stood silently in the shadows just outside the conference room. Diane Robinson, one of the company's most influential investors, had lingered after the presentation, intending to have a private word with Harold. Instead, she found herself witnessing a display of cruelty that made her blood boil. Diane's dark eyes narrowed as she watched the scene unfold. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. With each harsh word Harold spat at Mildred, Diane's anger grew. She had always prided herself on being a champion for equity and respect in the workplace. As a black woman who had fought her way to the top of the corporate world, Diane understood all too well the sting of discrimination and the importance of dignity for all employees regardless of their position. Mildred's quiet dignity in the face of Harold's verbal assault struck a chord deep within Diane. She saw in the elderly janitor a reflection of her own grandmother, who had faced similar prejudices with the same grace and resilience. As Harold's rant reached its ugly climax with the thinly veiled racist remark, Diane had seen enough. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned on her heel, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she strode away. The sound caught Harold's attention. He glanced up, his face still flushed with anger, just in time to see Diane's retreating back. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features as he recognized her. "Ms. Robinson?" he called out, his voice suddenly losing its harsh edge. But Diane didn't turn back. She continued walking, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Harold's stomach dropped. A creeping sense of dread began to replace his anger as he realized what Diane must have overheard. He looked around, suddenly aware of the sea of shocked and disapproving faces surrounding him. For the first time, Harold began to sense that something was terribly wrong. The weight of his words and actions started to sink in, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He glanced down at Mildred, who was still standing there, her eyes cast downward and then back at Diane's retreating figure. The realization that he might have just made a grave mistake washed over him like ice water. Harold opened his mouth to say something, anything, but found himself at a loss for words. Harold's heart raced as he glanced around the office, suddenly aware of the stunned faces staring back at him. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. He swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat as the weight of his actions began to sink in. One of his colleagues, a young man named Tim, approached him cautiously. "Mr. Jones," Tim whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think Ms. Robinson was just outside the conference room. She might have heard everything." Harold felt the blood drain from his face. His hands began to tremble, and he fought to maintain his composure. Diane Robinson wasn't just any investor. She was known for her unwavering commitment to workplace equality and respect. If she had indeed witnessed his tirade, the consequences could be catastrophic. He tried to steady his breathing, but panic was setting in. Images of his career crumbling before his eyes flashed through his mind. What if Diane decided to pull her investment? What if she reported him to the board? The possibilities were endless, and each one seemed worse than the last. Harold's eyes darted around the room, searching for Mildred. He found her quietly mopping up the spill, her face a mask of calm determination. Despite the public humiliation she had just endured, she carried on with her work, her movements slow but purposeful. The sight of Mildred's quiet dignity only intensified Harold's shame and fear. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he retreated to his office, closing the door behind him with shaking hands. Once alone, Harold collapsed into his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what Diane might do. She held significant sway within the company, and her opinion carried weight. If she decided to use her influence against him, his position as head of the office could be in jeopardy. He picked up his phone, considering calling Diane to explain, to apologize, to do damage control. But what could he possibly say? How could he justify his behavior? Harold set the phone down, his anxiety mounting with each passing moment. Outside his office, life went on. He could hear the muffled sounds of his employees returning to their tasks, their voices hushed and uncertain. And somewhere out there, Mildred continued her work, a silent reminder of his monumental mistake. Harold sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the computer screen before him, but his mind was far from the work at hand. The events of the morning played on repeat in his head, each recollection bringing a fresh wave of dread. He tried to focus on the quarterly reports, but the numbers blurred together, meaningless in the face of his growing anxiety. Every few minutes, his gaze darted to his email inbox, dreading the moment when a message from Diane Robinson would appear. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Harold's fingers drummed nervously on his desk, a habit he thought he'd long since overcome. As the day wore on, Harold found himself jumping at every sound. The ping of an incoming email made him flinch, and each knock on his office door sent his heart racing. He'd never felt so on edge, so vulnerable. During a brief moment of clarity, Harold realized he'd accomplished nothing all day. His to-do list remained untouched, a damning testament to his distracted state. He rubbed his temples, trying to ward off the headache that threatened to overtake him. Just as Harold was considering calling it a day and heading home early, his phone buzzed. It was an email notification. With trembling hands, He unlocked his phone and saw the sender's name, Diane Robinson. His breath caught in his throat as he opened the message. The email was brief and to the point. Diane requested a private meeting with Harold later in the week. There was no mention of the incident with Mildred, no hint of her intentions. The uncertainty only amplified Harold's fear. He read and reread the email, searching for any clue, any indication of what was to come, but Diane's words remained frustratingly neutral. Harold's mind raced with possibilities. Would she demand his resignation? Threaten to withdraw her investment? Or perhaps he dared to hope she hadn't overheard his outburst at all. As he stared at the screen, Harold knew one thing for certain. The next few days would be the longest of his life. The waiting, the uncertainty, the fear of what Diane might say or do. It was all almost too much to bear. Harold's paranoia continued to build as the days crept by. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, convinced that everyone in the office was talking about him behind his back. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making even the simplest tasks feel like monumental efforts. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Harold called his assistant into his office. "Nita," he said, his voice strained, "I need you to schedule meetings with the board members and other executives. Make it happen as soon as possible." Nita looked at him quizzically but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Jones. Any particular reason for these meetings?" Harold waved her off, not wanting to reveal his true motives. "Just routine check-ins. Nothing to worry about." As Nita left to arrange the meetings, Harold slumped in his chair. He hoped that by securing support from his superiors, he could protect himself from whatever action Diane might take. It was a desperate move, but he felt he had no choice. Meanwhile, Mildred continued her daily routine, pushing her cleaning cart through the office corridors. She was acutely aware of the tension that hung in the air, but she carried on with her duties as if nothing had changed. Her quiet dignity and unwavering work ethic stood in stark contrast to the chaos swirling around her. As Mildred dusted the picture frames in the hallway, she couldn't help but notice the worried glances cast her way by the other employees. She offered them a gentle smile, hoping to ease their discomfort. Despite the humiliation she had endured, Mildred refused to let bitterness take root in her heart. Harold, on the other hand, grew more frantic with each passing hour. He passed his office, rehearsing what he would say to the board members. How could he explain his actions without seeming weak or incompetent? The thought of losing everything he had worked so hard for made his stomach churn. As lunchtime approached, Harold stepped out of his office, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He spotted Mildred emptying trash bins near the break room and felt a pang of guilt. For a moment, he considered approaching her to apologize, but his pride held him back. Instead, he hurried past, averting his gaze. Mildred noticed Harold's anxious behavior but chose not to react. She simply continued her work, humming softly to herself as she had done for years. Her calm demeanor seemed to ripple through the office, providing a small measure of peace amidst the growing tension. The day of the meeting finally arrived. Harold's palms were sweaty as he straightened his tie and made his way to Diane's office. He took a deep breath before knocking on her door. "Come in, Harold," Diane's voice called from inside. Harold entered, trying to appear confident despite his racing heart. Diane sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to take a seat. "Thank you for coming, Harold," Diane began, her tone calm but firm. "I'm sure you're aware of why I've called this meeting." Harold nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, I believe so." Diane leaned forward, her eyes locked on Harold's. "I witnessed your interaction with Mildred last week. To say I'm disappointed would be an understatement." Harold felt his face flush with shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but Diane held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional, but cruel. It goes against everything this company stands for." Harold's shoulders slumped. He knew she was right, but hearing it from someone of Diane's stature made it all the more real. "I understand that leadership can be stressful," Diane continued, her voice softening slightly. "But that's no excuse for treating anyone, especially a longtime employee like Mildred, with such disrespect." Harold nodded, feeling a mix of guilt and fear. "I know I made a mistake," he said quietly. Diane's expression remained stern. "A mistake is one thing, Harold, but this speaks to a larger issue of how you view and treat your employees. It's clear that changes need to be made." She paused, letting her words sink in. Harold felt a chill run down his spine, realizing the gravity of the situation. "I'm giving you a choice, Harold," Diane said, her voice low but powerful. "You can either commit to changing your ways and treating all employees with the respect they deserve, or you can face the professional consequences of your actions." Harold's eyes widened. He understood the subtle ultimatum in her words. His future at the company hung in the balance. "The choice is yours," Diane concluded. "But know that I'll be watching closely. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated again." Harold nodded, his mind reeling. "I understand," he managed to say. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Diane simply nodded, indicating that the meeting was over. Harold stood on shaky legs and made his way to the door. As he left Diane's office, he felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He knew his future at the company was now uncertain, and it was up to him to prove he could change. Harold's mind raced as he left Diane's office. He knew he had to act fast to salvage his reputation and position within the company. His first thought was to make amends with Mildred, the elderly janitor he had so cruelly berated. With trembling hands, Harold dialed his assistant's extension. "Nita, please ask Mildred to come to my office as soon as possible," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," Harold called out, his voice cracking slightly. Mildred entered, her face calm and composed. She stood quietly, waiting for Harold to speak. "Please have a seat," Harold said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Mildred sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Harold cleared his throat. "Mildred, I wanted to speak with you about what happened last week," he began, his words stumbling out. "I behaved terribly, and I want to make it right." Mildred nodded but remained silent, her eyes fixed on Harold. "I've spoken with HR and I'd like to offer you a substantial bonus and a raise," Harold continued, pulling out a piece of paper with the figures written on it. He slid it across the desk towards Mildred. "It's the least I can do to make up for my behavior." Mildred glanced at the paper, then looked back at Harold. Her expression was kind but firm. "Mr. Jones," she said softly, "I appreciate your offer, but I'm afraid I must decline." Harold's eyes widened in surprise. But why?" he stammered. "It's a significant amount of money." Mildred smiled gently. "Mr. Jones, what I value most isn't money. It's respect. Respect for myself and respect from others. That's something no amount of money can buy." Harold sat back in his chair, stunned. He had been so sure that money would solve the problem, but Mildred's words hit him like a ton of bricks. "I've worked here for many years," Mildred continued, her voice steady. "I take pride in my work, just as you take pride in yours. All I ask is to be treated with dignity, regardless of my position." Harold felt a lump forming in his throat. He had never really thought about Mildred's feelings before, or the feelings of any of his employees for that matter. I don't know what to say," Harold admitted, feeling completely out of his depth. Mildred stood up, smoothing her uniform. "You don't need to say anything, Mr. Jones. Just think about it. Actions speak louder than words or money." With that, Mildred turned and left the office, leaving Harold sitting at his desk, utterly bewildered and unsure of what to do next. The office buzzed with hushed conversations and furtive glances in the days following Harold's outburst and his meeting with Diane. The once reverent atmosphere surrounding Harold had shifted, replaced by an uneasy tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As Harold walked through the office, he noticed how his employees quickly averted their eyes, or suddenly became engrossed in their computer screens. The usual greetings and small talk had all but disappeared, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. "Good morning, everyone," Harold said, trying to sound cheerful as he passed the cubicles. A few mumbled responses came back, but most people kept their heads down. Harold's assistant, Nita, approached him nervously. "Mr. Jones, your 10 o'clock meeting has been moved to tomorrow. Mr. Thompson said he had an urgent matter to attend to." Harold frowned. This was the third time this week that a meeting had been rescheduled. He couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with the rumors circulating about his confrontation with Mildred. As he turned to head back to his office, Harold caught sight of Mildred quietly mopping the floor near the break room. Unlike the others, she didn't shy away from his gaze. Instead, she offered him a small, gentle smile before returning to her work. Harold felt a twinge of shame as he watched her. Despite his cruel words and the public humiliation he had subjected her to, Mildred carried on with her duties, showing no signs of resentment or anger. Throughout the day, Harold couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Mildred's calm demeanor and his own increasingly frantic behavior. While he frantically tried to salvage his reputation, making phone calls and sending emails to key stakeholders, Mildred moved through the office with a quiet grace, attending to her tasks with care and dignity. During lunch, Harold overheard a group of employees talking in low voices near the water cooler. "Did you hear about what happened with Diane Robinson?" one whispered. "I heard she's furious with Harold," another replied. "My friend in accounting says she's considering pulling her investment." Harold's heart raced as he hurried past, pretending not to have heard. The rumors were getting worse, and he felt increasingly isolated. As the day wore on, Harold found himself watching Mildred more closely. He marveled at how she interacted with the other employees, always with a kind word or a gentle smile. Even those who had been reluctant to engage with Harold seemed at ease around Mildred. By the end of the day, Harold sat in his office, his head in his hands. The contrast between Mildred's quiet strength and his own desperate attempts to maintain control was becoming painfully clear. He realized that despite her position, Mildred commanded a respect that he, with all his power and authority, had failed to earn. As the days passed, Harold felt the walls of his once comfortable office closing in on him. The bustling workplace that had once been his domain now felt like hostile territory. Everywhere he turned, he saw signs of his waning influence and growing isolation. In the break room, conversations would abruptly halt when he entered. His usual lunch companions suddenly had other commitments or chose to eat at their desks. Even his most trusted team members seemed to be keeping their distance. One morning, Harold overheard two employees whispering near the copy machine. "Did you see how Diane was talking to Sarah from HR yesterday?" one of them said in a hushed tone. "Yeah, I bet they're planning some big changes," the other replied. "I wouldn't want to be in Harold's shoes right now." Harold's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as he quickly walked away, pretending not to have heard. His mind raced with possibilities. Were they discussing his future? Had Diane already decided to replace him? As he sat in his office, Harold's eyes darted nervously to his computer screen, checking and rechecking his email for any sign of communication from the board or Diane. Every notification made his heart race, fearing it might be the dreaded message announcing his termination. The upcoming board meeting loomed large in Harold's mind. He knew Diane would be addressing the company's culture and leadership, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his career hung in the balance. He spent hours preparing talking points and rehearsing possible defenses, but deep down, he knew his words might fall on deaf ears. Harold's paranoia grew with each passing day. He began to scrutinize every interaction, wondering if his colleagues were plotting against him. Even casual conversations in the hallway seemed loaded with hidden meanings and potential threats. One afternoon, as Harold walked to a meeting, he noticed a group of employees huddled together, speaking in low voices. When they saw him approaching, they quickly dispersed, avoiding eye contact. Harold's stomach churned with anxiety, convinced they had been discussing his precarious position. The weight of his isolation and the constant fear of what the future held began to take its toll. Harold found himself losing sleep, tossing and turning as he imagined worst-case scenarios. During the day, he struggled to focus on his work, his mind constantly preoccupied with the potential fallout from his actions. As the board meeting drew nearer, Harold's desperation grew. He considered reaching out to Diane directly, hoping to plead his case before the meeting. But every time he picked up the phone or started to compose an email, he hesitated, unsure of what he could possibly say to make things right. As the days ticked down to the board meeting, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic. His once confident stride through the office corridors now seemed hesitant and forced. He began making awkward attempts to engage with his employees, his smile strained and his eyes darting nervously. One morning, Harold stopped by the reception desk, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "Good morning, Susan, isn't it?" he said to the receptionist. "It's Sierra, sir," she replied, her eyebrows raised in surprise at his sudden interest. "Right, Sierra, of course. How are you today?" Harold asked, his voice unnaturally cheerful. Sierra blinked, taken aback by the unexpected question. "I'm fine, thank you," she answered cautiously. Harold nodded vigorously, his smile growing wider. "Excellent, excellent. Keep up the good work." He gave her a thumbs up before hurrying away, leaving Sierra bewildered. As he moved through the office, Harold made similar attempts with other employees. He complimented Mark from accounting on his tie, though Mark wasn't wearing one. He asked Jennifer from marketing about her children, despite her not having any. Each interaction left the staff more confused and uncomfortable than the last. During the weekly team meeting, Harold's behavior reached new levels of awkwardness. He insisted on starting the meeting with a team-building exercise, something he had never done before. "Let's all share one positive thing about a colleague," Harold announced, his voice overly enthusiastic. The room fell silent, the staff exchanging puzzled glances. When no one volunteered, Harold pointed to Tom, a junior analyst. "Tom, why don't you start?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, Lisa always brings in great cookies for the office." Harold clapped his hands together. "Wonderful, see how easy that was? Now, who's next?" The meeting dragged on, with Harold forcing each person to participate in his ill-conceived exercise. By the end, the staff was visibly relieved to escape the room. As the days went on, Harold's attempts at friendliness became more desperate. He started bringing in donuts every morning, insisting that everyone take one, even if they politely declined. He organized an impromptu office pizza party, though most employees found excuses to eat at their desks instead. The staff's reaction to Harold's sudden change was far from positive. Whispers and eye rolls followed him as he made his rounds through the office. His forced cheerfulness and transparent attempts at connection only served to highlight how out of touch he had been before. "Can you believe this act?" Lisa muttered to her colleague as Harold passed by, waving enthusiastically at everyone he saw. "It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion," her coworker replied, shaking his head. Despite the clear discomfort and skepticism from his employees, Harold persisted in his efforts, growing more desperate as the board meeting drew closer. His behavior only served to reinforce the staff's perception of him as insincere and self-serving, further isolating him in the very workplace he was trying so hard to win over. Harold sat at his desk, frantically scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, his brow furrowed as he brainstormed ideas for workplace initiatives. Team building exercises, diversity training, casual Fridays, he muttered to himself, circling each item with shaky hands. The next day, Harold called an all-staff meeting. As employees filed into the conference room, their faces showed a mix of curiosity and wariness. Harold stood at the front, a forced smile plastered on his face. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "I have some exciting announcements to make about our workplace culture." He launched into a presentation about his new initiatives. "First, we'll be starting weekly team lunches to foster better communication," Harold explained, gesturing to a poorly made poster board behind him. A few employees exchanged skeptical glances. Sarah from HR leaned over to whisper to her colleague, "Since when does he care about fostering communication?" Harold continued, his voice growing more enthusiastic with each announcement. "We'll also be implementing a mentorship program, regular diversity workshops, and—" He paused for dramatic effect. "Casual Fridays." The room remained silent save for a few uncomfortable coughs. Harold's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "These changes will help create a more inclusive and positive work environment for everyone," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the room. As the meeting ended and staff began to file out, Harold overheard snippets of conversation. "Can you believe this?" one employee muttered. "It's like he's trying to buy our forgiveness with pizza parties and jeans days." Another chimed in. "Too little, too late, if you ask me." Harold's shoulders slumped as he gathered his materials. He glanced up and caught sight of Diane standing in the doorway. Her face was unreadable as she observed the scene before her. Harold opened his mouth to speak, but Diane turned and walked away without a word, leaving him feeling more uncertain than ever. Over the next few weeks, Harold threw himself into implementing his new initiatives. He organized team-building exercises that felt forced and awkward. During one particularly uncomfortable trust fall activity, Harold nearly dropped his partner, causing even more tension in the office. The diversity workshops he arranged were led by outside consultants who seemed perplexed by Harold's overeager participation. He raised his hand for every question, his answers sounding rehearsed and inauthentic. "I believe in creating an inclusive environment where everyone feels valued," Harold declared during one session, his voice louder than necessary. The other participants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware of the disconnect between his words and his past actions. Throughout it all, Diane remained a silent observer. Harold would occasionally spot her watching from a distance, her expression neutral. He longed for some sign of approval or acknowledgement, but Diane offered neither. Her silence only added to Harold's growing anxiety. As the initiatives continued to fall flat, Harold's desperation became more apparent. He began micromanaging the casual Friday dress code, sending out lengthy emails about appropriate jean styles and shoe choices. His attempts to join in on water cooler conversations were met with awkward silences and quick exits. With each passing day, the gap between Harold's intentions and the staff's perception of him seemed to widen. His transparent motives and clumsy execution only served to reinforce the skepticism of his employees, leaving Harold feeling more isolated than ever. The day of the board meeting arrived, bringing with it a thick tension that seemed to hang in the air. Harold stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down his shirt, trying to calm his racing heart. As he drove to the office, Harold's mind whirled with worst-case scenarios. What would Diane say? Would she call him out by name? Would this be the end of his career? He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. Harold tried to steady his breathing, but each ding of the passing floors made his stomach lurch. When the doors finally opened, he stepped out on shaky legs. The boardroom loomed ahead, its glass walls offering no privacy from the curious glances of passing employees. Harold paused at the entrance, taking one last deep breath before pushing open the heavy door. Inside, the atmosphere was somber. Board members sat around the long table, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. At the head of the table sat Diane, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp and focused. As Harold took his seat, he felt the weight of everyone's stares. He kept his eyes down, fiddling with his pen to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. The room fell silent as Diane stood up, commanding attention without saying a word. "Good morning, everyone," Diane began, her voice calm but firm. "Today I'd like to address an issue that's been brought to my attention, one that affects the very core of our company culture." Harold's heart pounded in his chest. He risked a glance up only to find Diane's eyes sweeping across the room, making contact with each board member. "Respect and equity in the workplace aren't just buzzwords," Diane continued. "They're the foundation of a healthy, productive environment. When we fail to uphold these values, we fail our employees and ourselves." The room was silent, hanging on Diane's every word. Harold felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back as she spoke about the importance of treating every employee with dignity, regardless of their position or background. "Recent events have made it clear that we need to reassess our commitment to these principles," Diane said, her gaze briefly landing on Harold before moving on. "It's not enough to simply talk about respect. We must embody it in every interaction, every decision we make." As Diane continued her speech, Harold found himself shrinking in his chair. Her words, while never directly mentioning him, seemed to echo his recent actions. The memory of his outburst at Mildred played in his mind, filling him with shame. As Diane's speech continued, she suddenly shifted gears, her voice taking on a warmer tone. "Now, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone who truly embodies the values we should all aspire to," she said, a smile spreading across her face. Harold's brow furrowed in confusion. He glanced around the room, noticing equally puzzled expressions on his colleagues' faces. "For over 3 decades, we've had an employee who has shown unwavering dedication, dignity, and respect in her work," Diane continued. "Many of you may not even know her name, but I'm sure you've all benefited from her presence." A ripple of curiosity swept through the room. Harold felt his stomach tighten, a sinking feeling settling in as he began to realize who Diane was talking about. "I'm speaking of Mildred Phillips, our janitorial staff member," Diane announced, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "Day in and day out, Mildred has worked tirelessly to keep our offices clean and comfortable. She's done so with a grace and humility that we should all strive to emulate." Harold's face burned with shame as he remembered his cruel words to Mildred. He sank lower in his chair, wishing he could disappear. Diane went on, her words painting a vivid picture of Mildred's contributions. "Mildred arrives before dawn each day, ensuring our workspaces are spotless when we arrive. She treats everyone with kindness, regardless of their position. Her work ethic and positive attitude have quietly shaped our company culture for years." The board members nodded in agreement, some even smiling as they recalled their own interactions with Mildred. "In Mildred, we see the very best of what our company can be," Diane declared. "Hard work, dignity, and respect. These are the values that truly matter, the ones that create a positive work environment for everyone." As Diane's words sank in, something remarkable happened. One board member began to clap, then another and another. Soon, the entire boardroom erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, filled with genuine appreciation for Mildred's years of service. Harold sat frozen, his hands limp in his lap. The applause seemed to echo in his ears, each clap a reminder of his own failings. He felt exposed, as if every person in the room could see right through him, could recall his harsh words to Mildred. As the applause continued, Harold's shame deepened. He thought about how he had treated Mildred, how he had dismissed her importance. Now, hearing Diane's words and witnessing the board's reaction, he realized just how wrong he had been. The contrast between Mildred's quiet dignity and his own behavior was stark. Harold's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and he found himself unable to meet anyone's eyes. In that moment, surrounded by the sounds of appreciation for Mildred, Harold felt smaller than he ever had before. As the applause for Mildred gradually subsided, Diane raised her hand, signaling for quiet. The room fell silent, all eyes once again fixed on her. Harold, still reeling from the emotional impact of the moment, felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. Diane's expression turned serious as she addressed the board. "While we celebrate the positive example set by employees like Mildred, we must also address areas where we've fallen short," she said, her voice firm and resolute. Harold's heart began to race. He knew what was coming, but he felt powerless to stop it. "In light of recent events," Diane continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, "the board has decided to conduct a thorough review of our current leadership style, particularly that of our CEO, Harold Jones." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Harold felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. Diane's words cut through the tension like a knife. "This review will assess whether our leadership aligns with the values we claim to uphold. We'll be examining management practices, employee feedback, and overall workplace culture." Harold's mind raced. He thought of all the times he'd dismissed employees' concerns, of the harsh words he'd spoken to Mildred, of the fear he'd instilled in his staff. It all came crashing down on him at once. "We believe this review is necessary to ensure that our company maintains a respectful, inclusive environment for all employees, regardless of their position," Diane concluded, her tone leaving no room for argument. As the meeting adjourned, Harold remained rooted to his chair. He watched as his colleagues filed out of the room, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering among themselves. The reality of his situation began to sink in. When he finally found the strength to stand, his legs felt weak beneath him. He stumbled out of the boardroom, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The hallway seemed longer than ever before, each step a reminder of his uncertain future. Harold knew without a doubt that his job was no longer secure. The review would expose his flaws, his mistreatment of employees like Mildred. His reputation, once his most prized possession, now lay in tatters. As he reached his office, Harold closed the door behind him and sank into his chair. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. He realized that his behavior toward Mildred hadn't just been a momentary lapse in judgment. It had been the final straw that exposed his true character to everyone who mattered. Harold closed the door to his office, his hands trembling as he slumped into his leather chair. The room that once felt like his fortress now seemed to close in around him. He loosened his tie, feeling as if it were choking him. The events of the board meeting played over and over in his mind. The applause for Mildred, Diane's stern words, the announcement of the review. It all blurred together in a whirlwind of shame and regret. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a deep, shaky sigh. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. For the first time in years, Harold allowed himself to truly reflect on his actions. He thought about Mildred, her kind eyes and quiet dignity. How many times had he walked past her without a second glance? How many times had he dismissed her as just another cog in the machine? The memory of his outburst in the hallway made him wincy. He could still see the hurt in Mildred's eyes, the shock on the faces of his employees. In that moment, he had revealed his true self, not the successful businessman he pretended to be, but a bully who took out his frustrations on those he deemed beneath him. Harold's gaze fell on the framed awards and accolades that lined his office walls. They suddenly seemed hollow, meaningless. What good were they if he had sacrificed his humanity to achieve them? He thought about his colleagues, how they had avoided his gaze as they left the boardroom. People who once hung on his every word now couldn't bear to look at him. He had lost their respect, and he knew it would be a long, hard road to earn it back, if he even got the chance. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had always prided himself on being a strong leader, someone who got results. But now he realized that true leadership wasn't about intimidation or driving people to their breaking point. It was about respect, empathy, and bringing out the best in others. Harold's eyes stung with unshed tears. He thought about all the opportunities he had missed to be a better person, a better leader. How many Mildreds had he overlooked or mistreated over the years? As the gravity of his situation sank in, Harold felt a deep sense of remorse wash over him. He knew that his career, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard to build, was now hanging by a thread. And it was all because he had forgotten the most basic principle of human decency: to treat others with kindness and respect. The next day, Harold took a deep breath, steadying himself before he knocked on the door of the small supply closet that doubled as Mildred's office. His heart raced as he heard her gentle voice call out, "Come in." As he stepped inside, Harold was struck by the cramped space. Mildred sat at a tiny desk surrounded by cleaning supplies. She looked up at him, her kind eyes showing no trace of resentment. "Mrs. Phillips," Harold began, his voice wavering, "I was hoping we could talk." Mildred nodded, gesturing to a folding chair in the corner. "Of course, Mr. Jones. Please have a seat." Harold sat down, feeling out of place in his expensive suit. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. I wanted to apologize for my behavior the other day. The way I spoke to you was inexcusable." Mildred's expression remained calm, her hands folded neatly on her desk. She didn't speak, allowing Harold the space to continue. "I was wrong," Harold admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my stress and frustration get the better of me, and I took it out on you. That's no excuse for what I did." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm here to ask for your forgiveness, Mrs. Phillips. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." For a moment, the only sound in the tiny room was the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. Then Mildred spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Jones, I appreciate your apology. And yes, I forgive you." Harold looked up, surprised by her quick response. You do? Mildred smiled gently. Holding on to anger only hurts ourselves, Mr. Jones. Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves as much as others. Her words hit Harold hard, and he felt a lump forming in his throat. Thank you, he managed to say. But Mr. Jones, Mildred continued, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. What happened that day revealed a deeper issue, one that goes beyond just you and me. Harold nodded, feeling a mix of shame and curiosity. What do you mean? Mildred leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Harold's. In this company, in this world, we're all connected. From the CEO to the janitor, we all play a part in making things work. When we forget that, when we start seeing some people as less valuable than others, we lose something important. Her words resonated with Harold, making him see his actions in a new light. Mildred continued, her voice filled with quiet wisdom. Respect isn't something that should be earned, Mr. Jones. It's something we should give freely to everyone, regardless of their position or background. When we do that, we create a community where everyone can thrive. Harold felt tears welling up in his eyes, moved by Mildred's grace and insight. I've been so blind, he admitted. I've spent so much time focusing on success and results that I forgot about the people who make it all possible. Mildred reached out, patting Harold's hand gently. It's never too late to change, Mr. Jones. Every day is a new opportunity to treat others with kindness and respect. The following week, the office buzzed with excitement as employees gathered for an informal celebration. The company had decided to host an event to recognize the hard work and dedication of its staff. The large conference room had been transformed with colorful decorations, and tables laden with snacks and refreshments lined the walls. Harold stood near the entrance, watching as people filtered in. He felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, hope, and a newfound sense of humility. As he scanned the room, his eyes fell on Mildred, who had just arrived. What Harold saw next took him by surprise. Instead of blending into the background as she usually did, Mildred became the center of attention. Employees from every department flocked to greet her, their faces lighting up with genuine smiles. Mildred, so glad you could make it, exclaimed Chloe from accounting, giving the older woman a warm hug. Mrs. Phillips, you're looking lovely today, added James, a young intern, his eyes shining with admiration. Harold watched in amazement as person after person approached Mildred. They weren't just being polite, there was real affection in their greetings. Even the company's top executives made a point of seeking her out, treating her with the same respect they'd show to an esteemed colleague. As he observed the scene, Harold felt a profound realization wash over him. Mildred's position as a janitor had nothing to do with the respect she commanded. It was her character, her kindness, her dignity, her unwavering grace, that had earned her the love and admiration of everyone around her. He saw how Mildred listened intently to each person who spoke to her, offering words of encouragement or a gentle pat on the arm. She remembered details about their lives, asking after family members or congratulating them on recent achievements. In every interaction, Mildred made the other person feel valued and important. Harold's chest tightened with emotion as he realized the true meaning of respect and dignity in the workplace. It wasn't about job titles or salaries. It was about treating each person with kindness and recognizing their inherent worth as a human being. As he stood there taking in the scene, Harold felt a deep sense of shame for how he had treated Mildred in the past. But alongside that shame was a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could learn from her example and become a better leader, a better colleague, and a better person. As the celebration continued, Harold found himself drifting to the edges of the room. He leaned against a wall, his eyes never leaving Mildred and the crowd that surrounded her. The stark contrast between the warmth she received and the cool politeness extended to him was impossible to ignore. Harold's chest tightened as he watched Mildred laugh at a joke told by one of the interns. Her eyes crinkled with genuine mirth, and the sound of her laughter seemed to brighten the entire room. He realized he had never heard her laugh before, had never even thought to try and make her smile. A group of mid-level managers walked by, nodding curtly at Harold before making their way to Mildred. He saw how their faces softened as they greeted her, the respect in their eyes unmistakable. It hit him then, like a punch to the gut, how far he had strayed from being the kind of leader people genuinely admired. Harold thought back to his early days in the company, when he had been full of ambition and ideals. He had dreamed of being a leader who inspired others, who brought out the best in his team. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that dream, focusing instead on results and numbers at the expense of the people around him. As he watched Mildred interact with her colleagues, her friends, Harold felt a profound sense of loss wash over him. It wasn't the potential end of his career that hurt the most. It was the realization that he had squandered the opportunity to be the kind of leader that others would look up to, the kind that made people feel valued and respected. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Harold loosened his tie, feeling suffocated by more than just the physical discomfort. He had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that he had trampled over the very people he was supposed to lead and support. With a heavy heart, Harold pushed himself away from the wall. He couldn't bear to stay and watch any longer. As he made his way to the exit, he caught Mildred's eye across the room. She gave him a small, gentle smile, one that spoke of forgiveness and hope. It was more than he deserved, and it only served to deepen his resolve. Harold slipped out of the celebration, unnoticed by most. As he walked down the quiet hallway, away from the sounds of laughter and conversation, he felt both humbled and determined. The path ahead would be difficult, but he knew now what he needed to do. It was time to change, to become the leader he had once aspired to be, one who earned respect not through fear or position, but through his actions and character. In the days following the office celebration, Harold began to implement small but significant changes in his leadership style. He started each morning by greeting his employees as he walked through the office, making eye contact and offering genuine smiles. At first, his staff responded with surprise and uncertainty, unsure of what to make of this new behavior. Harold made a conscious effort to listen more and speak less during team meetings. He encouraged his employees to share their ideas and concerns, nodding attentively as they spoke. When Sarah from marketing suggested a new approach to their latest campaign, Harold didn't immediately dismiss it as he might have in the past. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions and thanked her for her input. As the weeks passed, Harold worked on acknowledging the contributions of his team members. He started leaving small notes of appreciation on their desks, recognizing their hard work and dedication. When the finance team successfully completed a challenging project ahead of schedule, Harold organized a small celebration, making sure to personally thank each member for their efforts. Despite his best intentions, Harold's new approach was initially met with skepticism. He overheard whispers in the break room, questioning his motives and wondering how long this act would last. Some employees seemed to brace themselves whenever Harold approached, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. One particularly challenging moment came when Harold asked his assistant, Tom, for feedback on his management style. Tom hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. Harold took a deep breath, reminding himself of his commitment to change, and gently encouraged Tom to speak freely. "Well, sir," Tom began hesitantly, "I think people are still getting used to this new you. It's a big change, and it'll take time for everyone to trust that it's genuine." Harold nodded, feeling a pang of regret for his past behavior. "I understand, Tom. Thank you for your honesty. I know I have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust, but I'm committed to doing better." As the days turned into weeks, Harold remained steadfast in his efforts. He made a point of learning more about his employees' lives outside of work, remembering details about their families and hobbies. When John from IT mentioned his daughter's upcoming school play, Harold made sure to ask about it the following week. Slowly but surely, the office atmosphere began to shift. The tension that had once permeated the air started to dissipate. Employees no longer fell silent when Harold entered a room. Instead, conversations continued, albeit with a hint of caution. Harold knew he had a long way to go, but he was determined to keep pushing forward. Each small interaction, each moment of genuine connection, felt like a step in the right direction. He was committed to becoming the leader his team deserved, one day at a time. As the weeks passed, Mildred's presence in the office began to take on a new significance. Her quiet strength and unwavering humility, once overlooked, now served as a beacon of inspiration for the entire staff. Employees found themselves pausing to observe her as she went about her daily tasks, her gentle smile and dignified demeanor, a constant reminder of the values they all aspired to embody. One morning, Nina from marketing approached Mildred as she was cleaning the break room. "Mildred," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you for always being so kind. Your positivity, it really makes a difference around here." Mildred looked up, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Oh, honey," she replied, "we all have the power to make a difference. It's just about choosing kindness every single day." Word of this exchange spread quickly through the office. Employees began to reflect on Mildred's words and actions, realizing that her approach to life and work was something they could all learn from. They started to emulate her patience and grace in their interactions with one another. The change was subtle at first. People held doors open for each other more often. Conversations in the break room became kinder, with less office gossip and more genuine interest in each other's lives. When deadlines loomed and stress levels rose, co-workers offered words of encouragement instead of criticism. Harold watched these changes unfold from his office, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. He felt a deep sense of regret for how long it had taken him to recognize the true value of people like Mildred. At the same time, he felt grateful for the opportunity to witness and be part of this transformation. One afternoon, Harold overheard a conversation between two junior employees, Lisa and Mark, as they discussed a challenging project. "I don't know if we can get this done in time," Lisa sighed, her voice tinged with frustration. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Hey, remember what Mildred always says? One step at a time with a kind heart. We'll figure this out together." Lisa's tension visibly eased. "You're right. Thanks, Mark. I needed that reminder." Harold felt a lump form in his throat. He realized that Mildred's influence had created a ripple effect throughout the office, fostering a culture of support and kindness that he, as a leader, had failed to cultivate for years. The office began to feel more like a community than a workplace. People started to organize small acts of kindness, bringing in homemade treats to share, offering to cover for colleagues who needed to attend their children's school events, or simply taking the time to ask how someone's day was going. As Harold observed these changes, he came to a profound realization. True leadership wasn't about enforcing strict rules or driving relentless productivity. It was about creating an environment where people felt valued, respected, and supported. It was about fostering a culture where kindness and empathy were just as important as meeting deadlines and hitting targets. That afternoon, Harold nervously adjusted his tie as he waited outside Diane's office. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of self-reflection and small, but meaningful changes. As Diane's assistant waved him in, Harold took a deep breath, steeling himself for what could be a make-or-break moment in his career. Diane sat behind her desk, her face unreadable as Harold entered. "Have a seat, Harold," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Harold lowered himself into the chair, his heart pounding. "Thank you for meeting with me, Diane," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Diane leaned forward, her eyes scrutinizing Harold's face. "I've been observing the changes in the office, Harold. I must say I've noticed some improvements." Harold felt a glimmer of hope. "I've been trying my best to implement what I've learned," he said earnestly. Diane nodded slowly. "Yes, I can see that. The staff seems more at ease. There's a sense of camaraderie that wasn't there before." She paused, her gaze still fixed on Harold. "However, let's be clear. These are just the first steps on a very long road." Harold nodded, feeling both relief and a renewed sense of responsibility. "I understand, Diane. I know I have a lot more work to do." "Indeed you do," Diane agreed. "Your past actions can't be erased overnight, but I believe in giving people a chance to redeem themselves." She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxing slightly. "I'm willing to give you that chance, Harold." Harold felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but Diane wasn't finished. "This doesn't mean you're off the hook," she continued, her tone firm. "Your actions will continue to be scrutinized. The board and I will be watching closely to ensure these changes are genuine and lasting." "I understand completely," Harold said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm committed to doing better, to being better." Diane's expression softened slightly. "I hope so, Harold, because the kind of leadership we need here isn't about power or control. It's about respect, empathy, and bringing out the best in others." She gestured towards the door, like the example Mildred has been setting all along. Harold nodded, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. "Mildred has taught me more than I ever could have imagined," he admitted. As Harold stood to leave, Diane's voice stopped him. "Remember, Harold, this is your second chance. Make it count." Harold left Diane's office, his mind racing. He felt relieved that he hadn't lost his job, but he also felt the weight of the responsibility he now carried. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, Harold felt truly motivated to become the leader his employees deserved. Harold sat alone in his office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk. The events of the past few weeks played through his mind like a movie reel, each scene a stark reminder of how far he had fallen, and how far he still had to go. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, one that had been gathering dust for years. It was a picture of his team from when he first became a manager, their faces beaming with hope and excitement. Harold couldn't remember the last time he'd seen those expressions in the office. With a heavy sigh, he set the photo down and leaned back in his chair. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something different. Hope. Harold's gaze drifted to the window where he could see the office bustling with activity. He watched as Mildred made her rounds, greeting each employee with a warm smile and a kind word. The genuine affection and respect she received in return was unmistakable. It hit him then, like a bolt of lightning. The respect Mildred commanded wasn't because of her position or her power. It was because of who she was, kind, compassionate, and genuinely caring about those around her. Harold felt a lump form in his throat as he realized how far he had strayed from being that kind of leader. He had demanded respect through fear and intimidation, never understanding that true respect couldn't be forced. It had to be earned. As he continued to watch Mildred, Harold began to see the path forward more clearly. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he knew now what he needed to do. He pulled out a notepad and began to jot down ideas, small steps he could take to show his team that he was committed to change. Listening more, praising often, showing genuine interest in their lives and work. Harold knew he had a long journey ahead of him. Years of bad habits and misguided leadership couldn't be undone in a day. But as he sat there, planning and reflecting, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The road to earning back the respect of his colleagues would be long and challenging, but for the first time, Harold felt ready to walk that path, no matter how difficult it might be. If you enjoyed the story of Harold, Diane, and Mildred, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.